Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we are going to be doing a bonus video in honor of the 15th anniversary of September 11th. This video is entitled Faith and Violence, and it's going to look into why unfounded beliefs lead to a confrontation. Now, I hope in the future to do more videos on faith and violence on this topic. There's a lot on my plate right now in terms of the number of videos we're creating. Stay tuned for a ton more and even another video publishing today. But after you watch the video, if there are other ideas for a series like this that you have, please offer them in the comments below. So, this video is not going to be a list of atrocities committed in the name of religion, though that list is long. It's not going to be an investigation into particular holy books to find justifications for violence, though many people do justify violence through holy texts. It's not going to be an argument that religious faith in the afterlife makes people more willing to give up their lives attacking others, though many faiths do promote suicidal attacks with the promise of paradise. It's not going to be an argument that inspiring blind faith makes it easier for followers to blindly follow orders and ignore their empathy for their enemies, though it does seem to be the case that moralistic faiths that turn the world into kind of good versus evil, us versus them, destroy natural compassion and dehumanize others. And it's not going to be an argument against particular kinds of faith. Remember, I'm a skeptic, so most beliefs probably fall under faith, in my view, religious, scientific, etc., over others, though some faiths are probably more guilty of violence than others are. As I mentioned, we may do other series on faith and violence, and we may bring up some of these topics at those points, but for now, our focus is going to be on a philosophical argument that having faith in something and wanting to convince others of your conclusions leads to violence and other forms of irrational persuasion. All right? So, before we get to kind of the specific argument, let's take a look at a thought experiment. So imagine someone named Francis. Francis has faith that he has a moral responsibility to protect the environment. I'm not going to be terribly specific of is this faith from maybe some kind of scientific ideals he has, from some just general feelings that he has, or from a particularly religious faith. It could be any and all of the above. He offers arguments to anyone that will listen from that ideal to such conclusions as we should invest in cleaner energy, drive smaller cars, and stop pollution. All of his arguments are valid, but they are based on the premise that we have a moral responsibility to protect the environment. He takes that premise on faith. Once you assume that premise, he provides all his arguments and moves forward, but if you don't agree with that premise, he has no argument to get you there, because he takes that premise on faith. Now imagine that Francis has a coworker named Rex. Rex does not believe that we have a moral responsibility to protect the environment. He does such things as drives large cars, drops dangerous trash on the ground, and funds political campaigns that want to reduce restrictions on oil and gas companies and invest less money in green energy. Every day that Francis sees Rex at work, he tries to convince him that what he is doing is wrong. Though Rex accepts that if he did have a moral responsibility to protect the environment, he would not be in the wrong. But since he doesn't have that belief, he doesn't have that faith that Francis does, he disagrees. And Francis doesn't have any reasons to support his belief because he takes it on faith. It's an element of his faith. And since Rex doesn't have the same faith, Rex doesn't have the same kind of axioms to build up from, be that holy texts or just personal feelings or whatever that Francis has this faith from, Francis cannot convince him. So what can Francis do? He believes that it is his moral duty to prevent Rex from doing harm to the environment, but he has no rational way to convince Rex. His only recourse, of course, is to resort to other ways to persuade Rex, irrational ways to persuade him, such as violence, threats, or insults. There's, of course, other irrational ways to persuade him, but those are often the most common, unfortunately. It's either that or give up on what he believes is his moral duty. Because Francis had faith in his morality instead of a rational argument to back it up, he had no rational options to convince Rex. Because of his faith, he was only left with irrational options like violence. Now you might say, well, then maybe Francis would go around and find some rational arguments to the conclusion that morally one should protect the environment. Well, once he's done that, he's no longer taking it on faith. Maybe he's taking it because those arguments are the case. So he's not the target of my argument anymore. It's only the target when he's taking claims simply on faith. Or maybe when he's taking those claims on faith and then building bad arguments under them just because he already accepts the conclusion and needs to find an argument to support it. That's probably equally problematic. And we'll get to those topics later in the video. For now, for our purposes, we'll define faith as follows. Firm belief in something for which one has no proof. I'll go more into kind of the counterfactuals of, well, if you were to take away the proof and you still believed it, that seems like something that's faith as well. You might have another definition of faith, but I'm not asserting that this definition is the correct one or the only one or even the only one I've offered in my videos, merely that it is the one I'm going to be using for the purposes of this argument. Another distinction that we'll make is between types of persuasion or discussion, between rational persuasion and irrational persuasion. So persuasion, we're talking about you're trying to convince someone of your point. You have rational persuasion is done via arguments. It involves valid arguments, not fallacies. It follows kind of the rules of deductive logic that we've laid out. For more on fallacies, check out my series, Fallacy February. Irrational persuasion, on the other hand, uses fallacious reasoning, appeals to force or threats, insults, violence, appeals to pity, indoctrination, or other fallacies to convince someone. Clearly, there is more than one way to convince someone of your point. The point is that rational persuasion does it through an argument, taking premises to a conclusion via some deductive system, while irrational persuasion does it through means outside of that argument, which are usually fallacious. Finally, let's make one more distinction between a rational and an irrational disagreement now. A rational disagreement results from two people with the same set of axioms or faith in the same things coming to different conclusions due to an error in reasoning on the part of one or both of them. So a rational disagreement is where you accept the same basic principles, but via your process of reasoning, you've gotten to two different conclusions, and you need to find out where in that process of reasoning someone messed up. An irrational disagreement, on the other hand, results from two people with different sets of axioms or faith in different things coming to different conclusions because of those axioms or that faith. Remember, as a skeptic, pretty much anyone that's believing or accepting anything has some degree of faith. So we're saying not has faith or doesn't have faith, but rather has the same faith or has different faiths. To make that clear, let's look at an example. So think about two utilitarians arguing about what is good. Now remember, utilitarians think that the thing that causes the most pleasure and reduces the most pain is the most good. They both agree that whatever brings the most pleasure brings the most happiness and is good. But they've counted the amount of pleasure differently, so they're disagreeing as to what is good. This is probably a rational disagreement. They agree on everything that they take for granted. They've simply counted the happiness differently. Maybe one just counted incorrectly. Maybe they are using different schemas for counting it, and they can discuss and debate on those points. As long as they're not taking different things on faith or taking different things for granted, they should be able to resolve this disagreement. If, however, the reason they disagreed was that one of them had faith that only human pleasure counted, while the other did not and was perhaps counting animal pleasures as well, it would have been an irrational disagreement. Note that only one of the people needs to have faith for the disagreement to turn irrational. Also note that the rational disagreement could be resolved while the irrational one now could not. Why can't it be resolved? Because before you could look at the premises and the arguments going all the way back to those common agreed upon axioms. But here, going back, you don't have anything that supports that axiom or that piece taken on faith. So there's nothing you can go back through line by line and say, well, here's where we're disagreeing. Here's where we have a problem. The problem is that basic acceptance of something on faith. It is also important to note that simply having faith did not cause the disagreement. They both could or have had faith in utilitarianism, accepted it with no rational argument, and still agreed. It wasn't the fact that someone had faith in the situation, but rather the fact they had different faith. Irrational disagreements only occur when the conclusions of different faiths are what is at stake, or the conclusions of faith and a lack of faith in a particular proposition. Now imagine that they disagreed on whose pleasure to count, but instead each had rational arguments based on common kind of axioms of logic that they both accepted. The disagreement is, once again, rational. I'll probably count those axioms of logic as some degree of faith, but at the end of the day, they have a common degree of faith, and probably a certain set of faith that's more common amongst a wider range of people. Even though they do still have faith in this case in the axioms of logic, since it was the same faith, an irrational argument did not arise. They might even have different faiths on other issues, but as long as those faiths are tangential to the particular argument they're looking at, it might still be possible for them to have a rational disagreement. To be clear, irrational disagreements cannot be solved by discussion. If someone had no reason for accepting something in the first place, then there is no reason of theirs that you can debate for them to give it up. When one of the utilitarians took it on faith that only human pleasure counted, the other had nothing to question, no common ground to go back down to reach to build up again from again. But when they both had come to different conclusions from the same beliefs, they could continue because they had the same starting point and could build back up from there and find at what point one of them perhaps misused a rule or misunderstood something. It seems that if you have a rational disagreement with someone, you can use either rational or irrational persuasion to convince them. Just because it is a rational disagreement doesn't mean you might not have someone that uses fallacious reasoning, but they could use rational arguments to resolve the discussion. However, if you have an irrational disagreement with someone, your only recourse is irrational persuasion, because someone has taken something on faith, and taking something on faith inherently implies that there's no argument backing it up, or that at least were you to dismantle any argument they had backing it up, they would still hold that claim. And so your only recourse is to persuade them irrationally. An irrational disagreement precludes rational means of convincing someone. So if you want to persuade them, you must resort to irrational techniques of persuasion, which are generally fallacious and often include violence. So here's the argument. If someone has faith about some topic X, then they will have an irrational disagreement with anyone that either lacks faith or has a different faith regarding X. If you're suspicious that there's some things that everyone has faith on, well, I'm a skeptic and I don't really have any faith. So anything you have faith on, you probably are going to end up in an irrational disagreement with me around. If you want to convince someone with which you have an irrational disagreement, you can only resort to irrational means of persuasion, violence, threats, insults, etc. Clearly, there are other irrational means of persuasion that we've mentioned, but these, unfortunately, are often the most common. And for more on the skeptic comment, we're going to address skepticism in this issue at the end of the video. If someone of faith about topic X wants to convince someone that lacks faith or has a different faith regarding topic X, they must resort to irrational means of persuasion, such as violence, threats, indoctrination, insults, and so on. The point here is that when you build an argument off of faith and try to convince someone that has a different faith or lacks faith, the only way you can convince them is via violence, threats, indoctrination, insults, other versions of irrational persuasion. And that, for a lot of people, is a problem. Let's look at some defense of these premises. So this first premise seems to follow directly from our definition of irrational disagreement. If I have an argument that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and someone else has faith that 2 plus 2 equals 5, we really have an insoluble irrational disagreement. Because even though I have an argument, someone else just has faith that that is the case, and so they can dismiss my argument offhand because they've already accepted that 2 plus 2 equals 5. Think of it like a formal language with axioms and deductive rules. Even assuming our deductive rules are the same, if you start with different axioms, you'll get different results. Imagine we have a formal language with the alphabet FA, and ask the question, can you prove the statement FA? We give people the following rules. You can take an A off the end of anything. XA implies X, where X is any string of letters, including a null string. You can double any string of letters. X implies XX. Once again, any string of letters, including a null string. And whenever you have two F's in a row, you can replace them with an A. XFFY implies XAY. Hopefully all of that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, watch my video on what our formal language is. However, we now give them each a different axiom to start with to work off of. One gets axiom 1, FF, and the other gets axiom 2, FFFFF. Now, using those same rules, they are both going to try to prove FA. If you are a fan of formal logic and you want to give it a try now and pause the video. But if not, let's keep going. So, using axiom 2, it's actually pretty easy to conclude FA. You don't even need to use rule 2. Use rule 3 to put the A at the end, rule 1 to knock it off, and then rule 3 to turn those two F's back into an A. Again, you have FA. And yet, with axiom 1, no matter what you do, you will not be able to conclude FA just from axiom 1, because you'll never be able to get an odd number of F's. Interestingly enough, from axiom 2, you can't get to axiom 1, and from axiom 1, you can't get to axiom 2. It's problematic. Basically, we have two people that have something they've taken on faith, they've been given as an axiom, and they have a similar set of deductive rules, but they disagree as to the truth of a particular proposition, or the provability of FA. So we can't answer the question, is FA provable? The holder of axiom 2 says, yes, it's provable, but they can't convince the holder of axiom 1 to adopt axiom 2, since there's no rule in the system that allows him to do so. We can't deduce axiom 2 from axiom 1. There's no rational argument for it. There's no sense right now, because it's an abstract formal language, of a reason we should accept axiom 2 over axiom 1. And no more can the holder of axiom 1 get the holder of axiom 2 to reject his axiom and demonstrate that, well, we can't actually prove FA. This kind of simulates the rational tools of argument that we have to convince someone in our abstract way, so we're not thinking of ways you can argue for axiom 1 or axiom 2. The point is, they're taking these things on faith. They're taking these things as axioms, so there should be no argument for them. They're just the basic building blocks that you have to build everything else out of. Starting a discussion, when you each have faith in different things, is just as counterproductive as trying to make the same conclusions from different axioms. You might each be fully logical and agree on the same rules of deduction, just as our two axioms had the same set of rules. But with different starting points, you'll inevitably end up with different conclusions. Now let's look at a defensive premise 2. When two people have a rational disagreement, you can question their reasoning, but faith in a belief is something you can't productively question. You could call someone stupid, block them on social media, declare war on their faith, advocate for their faith to not be taught to children, but you can no longer have a rational discussion with them. Because once you get to that basic axiomatic point where you don't agree, you're in different systems, you're in different worlds, you're not even talking about the same things anymore. Why can we not reason with someone who has faith and convince them to give it up? Well, I'd say the answer has basis in the problem of underdetermination. No matter what evidence one is presented with, you may always maintain something you have faith in by discarding other beliefs. If you're unaware of the problem of underdetermination, I highly suggest you check out my series, A Theory is Just a Theory, for more information. So now, imagine two people that hold the belief, I am in Seattle. One holds it because she looks outside and sees the Space Needle, because she got off a plane this morning in SeaTac, and she saw her cousin for lunch, and her cousin lives in Seattle. The other, he had all the same experiences, they both have cousins in Seattle, but takes the belief, I am in Seattle, on faith. Now imagine that it's revealed to both these people that the view outside their window is a lot in Hollywood. Their cousin calls them to tell them that everything was a practical joke, and they realize, I've never been to SeaTac before, I have no idea what it looks like. Her reasons for holding her belief have been undermined. So it might seem at least rational to change it, or she might seem to have some pretty good reasons to change that belief. She had reasoned to it, and because she had reasoned to it, and then those reasons were undermined, she may change it. But his have not. Nothing has shaken his faith. He might easily throw out such other beliefs as my cousin tells the truth, or my eyes are always reliable, and even remain rational and contradiction free. Because once you end up with a contradiction, you're underdetermined as to which beliefs you should throw out. Now, the real and deeper problem with underdetermination is that she could honestly do the same, throwing out such beliefs as my cousin tells the truth, or my eyes are reliable. However, this would mean that, though she might be internally rational, having lost any proof that she's in Seattle, it seems that she's now taking that claim on faith, which is going to put her back into this argument. I would say if you hold on to a particular belief, even though your justification for it was undermined, that belief is something that you take on faith, even if you don't realize it. Imagine that you believe in God. You probably have reasons to do so. You don't just take it on blind faith. Imagine now that those reasons were disproven or stripped away. Would you still believe? If so, you have faith. If the reasons that you believe were to be taken away, and you still believe, it seems to me that you have faith. Even though you've come up with these reasons to kind of prop up this belief you already had, it seems that the real meaning behind it, or the real reasons you have for that belief, are because you have faith in it, not because of these other reasons that you use to kind of rationalize your belief. Similarly, imagine now that you're a scientific realist that believes the capital T truth of scientific theories. If someone, say, offered you an argument that the scientific method is not importantly connected to truth, would you still believe? If so, then I'd say you have faith, because you definitely have, even though you had perhaps an argument for scientific realism, if it was demonstrated that that argument fell apart and you still hold that belief, you definitely have faith. And if you do hold that belief right now, I definitely encourage you to check out my videos on the problem of underdetermination as well as the problem of induction. So an obvious application of this argument is to religion in particular. If someone has faith that homosexuals should not marry, for example, and they're discussing with someone else that disagrees, their only recourse, unless you both have the same set of faith or the same dogma you're going back on, is to resort to irrational means of persuasion, such as protesting things or advocating for particular laws to be changed, but not actually discussing or debating the issues and trying to convince someone, merely fighting them. And that's not to say that all religion is committed to such blind faith, or that it's required, but rather that there are many people who attempt to persuade others through irrational means, instead of rational ones, because of their faith, because their faith has led them to the only possible conclusion is, I have to convince these people, I have to stop this bad thing in the world, and my faith doesn't give me the rational tools to do that, so I have to resort to irrational means of persuasion, which often are violent, unfortunately. But there are also many people that say, I disagree with you, but that doesn't give me a reason to fight you or use these irrational means of persuasion on you, because maybe they're epistemically humble and think, well, maybe I could be wrong. I might have a personal belief in it, but I don't think it's so justified that I should be pushing it on others. However, the same can be said of many proponents of scientific realism, for example, taking the truth of inductive conclusions on faith may sound less drastic than taking the claims of the Bible on faith, but the argument will apply just as easily. The harm done can be seen perhaps less in physical violence, especially historically, and more in maybe cruel comments sent to anyone that questions what is frankly scientific dogma online, and the problem is just as irrational and faith-based. As before, clearly not all scientists are scientific realists, but that does not mean that faith in science cannot in principle inspire violence just as faith in religion can. If you want more on faith in science and why or whether science rests on faith, check out my video on the subject. Now finally, let's get back to my position. Couldn't one argue that the skeptic is just as much to blame in this as well? Irrational disagreements are between people of faith and people without that particular faith. As they say, it takes two to tango. So if we all had faith in the same set of propositions, wouldn't this reduce our irrational disagreements and violence? And isn't the skeptic, by doubting such very, very common things as the laws of logic, actually causing more irrational disagreements and violence? A good objection. And this may be the case for some skeptics, but clearly there are different faiths. If there is any neutral ground between faiths, it's a lack of faith. Just because a lot of people believe in classical logic doesn't mean that there aren't non-classical logics out there, and that the only neutral ground between those is lack of faith in either of those sets of axioms. Furthermore, as an indirect skeptic, I try to take on the positions of others and then show that they lead to internal problems, not try to fight them from the outside. By assuming the axioms of others, I get rid of the possibility of that irrational argument, because I've assumed the things they've taken on faith and then seen that maybe they run into some problems, at least with common intuitions. But of course, if we were all skeptics and lacked faith entirely, surely we could have discussions and debates free from violence. And be on neutral ground, not be forced into one person's corner or another. What do you think? Does faith inspire violence? Are there times when faith is not harmful and times when it is? Leave your comments below, and also please think about future videos for this kind of faith in violence series. Hopefully it will become a series at some point in the future. Like I said, we have a lot of videos coming up. We probably have at least 2 more publishing this week, and then we're going to start a 2 daily series going one right after another. So lots of videos to come from Carneades.org. I hope you have a good September 11th, and stay skeptical, everybody.